Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we cut through the noise and get straight to the insights that matter. Today, we're diving into something truly crucial and maybe a bit surprising: the profound contributions of health psychology to tackling climate change. You might not immediately connect those two things. Our source for this is a recent review from the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. It's from 2025 by Elisa Kern, Castro, and Marta Reis. And our mission today really is to unpack how understanding human behavior isn't just part of the climate solution, but actually a critical and, well, often overlooked piece of the whole puzzle.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating here is how our whole idea of health is shifting. We're kind of moving beyond that older, more fragmented view, the one that sort of separated mind and body. Now, the biopsychosocial paradigm is getting more traction. It integrates the psychological, the social dimensions, and really emphasizes well-being, quality of life. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's all about recognizing that human health is just so intricately linked to the health of our environment. We're talking animals, plants, the ecosystems we rely on. This one health approach, it makes it crystal clear. Since ecosystem degradation and climate change are, well, largely human cause, fixing them or mitigating them absolutely demands profound behavioral change. There's sort of no way around that.
You've really hit on the core paradox right there, haven't you? Despite this super clear link, insights from behavioral science are surprisingly often left on the sidelines when it comes to climate governance. So this deep dive, we're hoping it'll illuminate why health psychology, with its focus on behavior change and well-being, is so uniquely positioned here, and also what barriers we need to, get past. Okay, so when you think about climate change, your mind probably goes straight to melting ice caps, right? Or rising sea levels, economic impacts. But here's where it gets really interesting, maybe a bit unsettling too. Our sources show climate change functions as a significant psychological stressor. What does that actually mean for us, for our mental and emotional well-being?
Right. From a health psychology angle, stress isn't just about those huge one-off events. It's more when demands, either internal or external, environmental ones, are perceived as threatening or unpleasant or just generally bad. And that perception triggers a psychophysiological response. It varies from person to person, of course. And climate change, well, it brings both acute and chronic stressors into the mix.
Okay, so acute and chronic, what's the difference there? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. Think of acute stressors as those immediate, sometimes overwhelming psychological reactions. We're talking about things like big natural disasters, hurricanes, wildfires, floods, events that hit hard and fast. These often trigger immediate trauma responses. Things like PTSD, acute stress disorder, anxiety, depression, sleep problems. And the research shows this stuff can linger for months, sometimes even years. And it's not random who's most affected. Risk factors include, how big the event was, losing a loved one, being female, low socioeconomic status, even things like ethnic minority status or having a family history of mental health issues.
Wow, okay, so that's the sudden shock. What about the chronic side?
Right, so chronic stressors are more like that persistent, low-grade stress. It just sort of accumulates over time. Think about the gradual rise in global temperatures, the sea level slowly creeping up, those long droughts, or really intense heat waves that seem to go on forever, these ongoing environmental changes. They're linked to higher rates of anxiety, depression, and this kind of pervasive feeling of helplessness. And it seeps into everything: employment, food security, transport, even cultural identity in our social connections. And even things we might call subacute, like prolonged heat waves, they're linked to stuff like increased aggression, delinquent behavior, higher suicide rates, particularly among men and older people, and even hormonal imbalances. It's really insidious.
So it's not just the direct catastrophic hit, but also this slow, relentless burn that really gets under our skin and erodes our well-being. It makes you wonder, if these impacts are so widespread, are we seeing new psychological conditions emerge, like new ways of defining this distress?
That's a really critical question.
Yeah.
And yes, beyond the direct impacts like PTSD from a flood, we are seeing these profound emotional responses: despair, sadness, grief. And that's leading to some newer concepts. Climate anxiety, for instance. It's this condition marked by fear, helplessness, guilt, all directly tied to climate change. We see it a lot, especially among younger generations. And then there's ecological grief. That's the term for the sorrow and distress linked to environmental losses, whether they've happened already or are just anticipated. The whole crisis sort of forces us to confront mortality more directly, our own, and maybe even, the wider species level.
It's easy to think, okay, climate anxiety, that must be for people directly hit by a disaster, but you're saying it's broader than that. How does it affect someone, say, who hasn't personally lost their home to a wildfire?
That's a really important distinction. You're right, it isn't just restricted to those with direct experience. Climate anxiety can definitely arise just from your subjective perception of the threat. Maybe you're highly aware of the ecological risks, or you just feel personally vulnerable, even if you're geographically far away from the immediate impacts. Now, some anxiety in uncertain situations is normal. It's not automatically a pathology, but it can become clinically significant if it really starts messing with your daily life, disrupting sleep, hurting work performance, making you withdraw socially. And these experiences, they can also strain relationships, weaken your support networks, and just generally heighten vulnerability, especially for people already at risk, like those with pre-existing health conditions, indigenous communities, kids, the elderly.
Okay, so we're seeing this pervasive psychological impact. There's this huge challenge. Why do so many people seem to fail to act, even if they say they believe in climate change? There seems to be a massive disconnect there.
Exactly. That's a central puzzle. A key factor in whether someone acts is, obviously, their belief in climate change. Do they accept it's real? Human-caused? Bad? But climate change denial, or maybe inaction is a better word sometimes, it isn't always simple rejection. It can be driven by some really interesting psychological mechanisms, like cognitive dissonance. That uncomfortable feeling when your actions don't line up with your beliefs. Sometimes it's just psychologically easier to tweak your belief about the threat of climate change than it is to overhaul your entire lifestyle. Change is hard.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We avoid discomfort.
We do.
Yeah.
And there's also the influence of things like mortality awareness, that underlying, often subconscious, fear of death that can make us push away existential threats. And system justification, that's our tendency, often unconscious, to defend the existing social and economic systems we live in, even if they're part of the problem. Plus, just recognizing that fixing climate change requires collective action, well, that can feel overwhelming. It can lead to a sense of powerlessness, which definitely discourages individual effort.
So it's like feeling overwhelmed before you even start.
Right. And one term the research uses for this is eco-paralysis. It's basically a state of inaction that comes from feeling like nothing you do, and maybe nothing even governments do, is enough to tackle this huge crisis. That feeling of, what difference can I possibly make? And here's another subtle thing. Pluralistic ignorance. Most people actually do care about climate change, but they tend to underestimate how much other people care or how much others are acting. This misperception that you're alone in your concern or that nobody else is doing anything can be a really powerful barrier to collective action. People hold back.
Okay, so it's not just about individual beliefs or even a lack of concern. It's also about how we perceive the risk itself and how we view what everyone else is doing or not doing. It sounds like our own brains are kind of tripping us up here.
Precisely. Risk perception is all about our subjective evaluation of threats. It's shaped by how we think, how we feel, social influences, cultural norms, the whole package. And we often have this bias where we underestimate our own risk compared to others. This creates a gap between how threatened we feel and how threatened we actually are. Plus, humans, we're generally wired to prioritize immediate worries over long-term, more abstract risks. So we might react really strongly to a specific hurricane hitting the coast because it's immediate, tangible, dramatic. But we might fail to see climate change itself as this overarching existential threat that needs constant, ongoing action, not just a reaction to the latest disaster.
That makes sense. The slow creep is harder to react to than the sudden bang.
Definitely. And beyond our individual psychology, there are ideological factors too. Misinformation plays a huge role, obviously. Financial and political interests can actively work against climate action. And then there are the very real external constraints. Sometimes the infrastructure just isn't there for sustainable choices. Maybe there's a lack of government support or policy. And honestly, sometimes change in deeply ingrained habits is just plain inconvenient. All these things impede climate-positive behaviors.
So what's the practical takeaway here for you, our listener? We've talked about the problems, the barriers. This deep dive highlights that health psychology has this really unique expertise. How do we actually use that? How do we move from awareness to meaningful action?
Yeah, this is where health psychology can really shine. It's got the tools for behavior change. And it's not just about pushing traditional healthy choices anymore. It's about fostering what the research calls sustainable healthy behaviors. So for example, yeah, playing sports is healthy. But if your sport involves, say, driving gas-guzzling vehicles everywhere, that's not environmentally sustainable, is it? This leads to the planetary health approach. It's about explicitly linking human health with the health of our planet's ecosystems. The core idea is that disrupting Earth's systems, climate change being a prime example, has direct and indirect impacts on our health. It demands a more holistic view.
That feels like a really important shift in perspective. So, how do health psychologists actually do this? What are the strategies, the mechanisms for driving that behavior change?
Well, health psychologists have expertise in understanding how behavior changes, how to design interventions, how public health initiatives work. These are all crucial skills for developing climate mitigation strategies. Part of it is identifying the key behaviors that really matter for mitigating climate change. And interestingly, a lot of these overlap with things we already know are good for personal health, like choosing active transport, walking or cycling, or eating more plant-based foods.
Right, so there are co-benefits.
Exactly, lots of co-benefits. And then it's about implementing behavioral triggers, using approaches like nudges. Quad. Nudges are those subtle changes in the environment that kind of gently guide people toward more sustainable choices without forcing them. Think about things like making green energy the default option on your utility bill, or putting up signs reminding people to reduce waste, or offering small financial incentives for climate-friendly purchases. But it's important to say, nudges alone aren't enough. They work best when they're part of a bigger picture, supported by policies that help form long-term habits and drive systemic changes.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. It sounds like you're describing a two-way street. It's not just how climate change impacts our health and behavior, but also how our health behaviors collectively impact the climate. It's this reciprocal relationship.
Exactly right. It's completely bidirectional. If we want to mitigate the bad health effects of climate change, we have to adapt our own health behaviors to minimize our environmental impact. So for instance, a health intervention that accidentally ends up increasing carbon emissions, that's actually counterproductive from this broader planetary health perspective. And climate change also tends to make existing health disparities worse, behavioral disparities too, across different social groups. So interventions need to be targeted and consider those inequalities. Ultimately, getting real pro-environmental behavior change requires both large-scale individual action and coordinated political effort. It's not one or the other.
And emotions play a role too. You mentioned anxiety and grief earlier.
Yes, emotions are huge. They can be triggers for inaction, like eco-anxiety sometimes paralyzes people, but they can also be motivators. Engaging in sustainable actions can actually generate positive emotions, pride, satisfaction, a sense of efficacy. And those positive feelings can reinforce further action. It can create a positive feedback loop. But scaling all this up, making it society-wide, that requires integrating psychological insights with social approaches, political action. It means promoting structural changes that just make the pro-environmental choice the easy choice, the convenient choice, the socially normal choice.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the core takeaway from this deep dive? For me, it really underscores that health psychology isn't just, relevant, it seems absolutely crucial, but still kind of underutilized in tackling climate change. It's not just about the climate science or the policy debates, but about understanding our deepest human responses, our behaviors, our psychology in the face of this massive challenge.
Absolutely. And despite that huge potential, real barriers remain. Things like limited specialized training for health psychologists, specifically on climate issues. Sometimes just insufficient awareness within the field itself. Maybe some hesitancy to jump into interdisciplinary work. And, as always, challenges securing funding for this kind of research, overcoming climate denial or just resistance to behavior change, and really embedding psychological insights into public policies. Think urban planning, education systems, public health campaigns. That's paramount. And it really requires stronger advocacy, much more coordinated collaboration between psychologists, policymakers, public health folks, environmental scientists. Everyone needs to be talking to each other.
This deep dive really suggests a profound shift in thinking might be needed. If climate change is fundamentally a crisis of human behavior, of human perception, then maybe our most powerful tools aren't just technological or political. Maybe they lie within us, within the subtle, often overlooked workings of the human mind itself. What if understanding our own psychological wiring, our biases, our motivations, what if that's the ultimate climate solution? What if we need to actively engage with and harness these internal forces for the well-being of the planet? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you continue to explore this vital intersection of human health and planetary well-being, and maybe even think a little differently about your own daily choices in the bigger picture.